which is okay.
So the article that I sent to Josh with the Henry Louis Gates article.
Yes.
So
Those are interesting.
Skip Gates grew up, see, this is the beginning of this, he's known by Skip everywhere except on TV. His name is, he grew up in Piedmont, West Virginia, he mentions in the beginning of that article. I grew up in, it's called the Tri-Towns, there are 3 little towns, 2 on one side of the Potomac River in Maryland and 1 in, and he was in the West Virginia town. My church was in the town that he grew up in. He's famous, he's the only person ever to go to Harvard from that area.
West Virginia.
Yeah.
I'm chuckling.
Piedmont, West Virginia, so you wanna join the class today? Is this a class?
Yeah,
Yeah, come on in, come on in.
Find it.
Yeah.
And so he's like the most famous person to ever come out of that area, but yeah, so I mean, I follow his stuff quite,
Yeah,
yeah. So he's older than I am, but I mean, we all knew him, so.
really cool. That is very cool. Yeah, I always enjoy watching.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And his specials and stuff.
Tuesday night.
His books are good, yeah.
yeah.
But he's, yeah, so anyway, so I always pay attention to this stuff, but that article I thought was really good, going back to the history of this Rutherford
Yes.
person that I'd never heard of.
Well, that's what I have kept thinking about as we're going through this book is that group of people, the women,
United Daughters of the Confederacy,
yes.
They're
were the ones that did this whole thing. And this author didn't really emphasize that, but that has really struck me.
Well, I will tell you, never underestimate a organized group of women who have, women survivors, or what we would call Gold Star women,
yeah,
who've lost
Oh,
husbands,
yeah.
sons, now daughters,
Yeah.
and their effect over a period of time. There's an interesting article that I read after I watched this movie about a submarine, Russian submarine, and there and I think it was called the Kursk. It was called Kursk, I think. It was a Russian nuclear submarine that had an accident. Nobody really knows exactly what happened, right? So it's dramatized. But this was right on the heels of Chernobyl, I believe. And the submarine basically went down in the North Sea. It was part of the Baltic fleet. Went down in the North Sea, and they had the means. They had a way you could go down and rescue. So this thing was sitting on the bottom of the sea, which isn't very deep, and they had a means you could go down and rescue. Attach a hatch and all this kind of stuff. But come to find out that through corruption and lack of maintenance, they had 2 of these rescue subs. One of them they had sold to a commercial company. The local commander had sold it to him to do, because you could go down pretty deep and do some stuff on the other one was in disrepair. And so the Soviets could have asked, I think it was a British unit that had like the same kind of dimensions on their submarines, because the Soviets had stolen some of the plans to the British submarines.
Wow.
And incorporated like for sealing a hatch. But the Soviets didn't. They didn't admit that their sub had sunk, was in trouble. And so, over a period of time, there's this drama, and finally the word gets out. And the mother, and all of the sub was from a base in Russia, and so all of the families and everything lived there. I mean, like generations of families, sort of like the Crimea, which is why when Putin says that Crimea is Russian territory, it's because the Black Sea Fleet was there for so many years, and they moved all of these. So and that resonates. So this group of mothers and wives got fed up with it and started making noise in the media and stuff like that. And it was that coupled with Chernobyl and the response to Chernobyl, you know, complete disarray, lying to the public and all this kind of stuff. It was one of these things that sort of tipped, you know, the end of the Soviet Union. So you read the UDC,
Yep.
you know, same thing. They were there at, you know, Washington and Lee. They were up at West Point. They're in Arlington, everywhere. Okay, who do we have?
We lost your dad and Marcelo. I don't know where they went, but they're gone.
It looks like also I'm still talking.
It
I'm
does.
still
look-
here. I'm just listening.
That's strange.
Oh. That's very weird.
That's really weird.
That's delayed.
I wonder, is there,
You haven't waved yet.
It's like a 10-second delay.
Yeah,
yeah, that's probably not gonna work.
there's the wave.
Here's your ad.
I don't. Is there a way, is this,
Well, let's see.
are we recording it?
Yep, it's being recorded. It's being broadcast on YouTube.
Okay, so what is this?
So this is what everybody's seeing.
Right, but is that
So-
Zoom or,
Well, you've got the Zoom screen, but then we're also broadcasting it on YouTube.
But if-
So-
if they're both behind.
where's Zoom?
So I wonder.
Wonder if we should be on one and not the other. Oh, see, there's everybody there. Okay, let's keep it on this one, because I think,
Okay,
There we go.
yeah.
yeah, there we go. Okay,
Okay,
That's better.
all right.
all right.
We are working on, can you hear me, Kitty?
Yes.
All
and
right, Mom, you got me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
She's mute.
Hear me.
He's on.
You're on mute, okay. And Marcelo, you with us?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, awesome. So we'll go through our sort of standard opening ritual now that we've worked through our technical issues. And so we're just gonna off of the attachment that was in Josh's email to everybody. We'll go through, we'll do the corporate opening prayer, and then we'll go through the commitments to presence. And then I'll explain, we're gonna go about this class just a little differently than we have some of the other ones. And I'll explain how and why when we get to that point, okay? So if you could please join me in our opening prayer. Oh, Holy Spirit, giver of life, whose breath fills our lungs at this very moment. You are above all powerful and true. Be alive in us today against the silence towards racism in this land, that we might be filled with your words. Words that heal, liberate, and offer hope in our day. Let us speak and let our lives in tandem with our words be a way of witness in the world for you and the liberation of your Black people. God, amen. Okay, so we'll do the commitments of presence, and I think we have a maintenance shed clean out and cleanup going on. So I think a couple of folks are over participating in that. So there is probably one for everybody, one commitment of presence for everybody. So I'll start and then we'll go around the room here and then we'll go out into Zoom land. So be fully present. Set aside the usual distractions of things undone from yesterday, things to do tomorrow, and things impinging on the present through technology.
Listen generously, listen intently to what is said, listen to the feelings beneath the words, listen to each other as you would listen to scripture, attentively, mindfully, and open to the whole.
We come as equals. No person's gifts, limits, or experiences are more or less important than another's.
It is never share or die. You will be invited to share stories, but you will determine the extent to which you want to participate.
No fixing. We are not here to change someone else's mind or to fix them.
Kitty, could you do the next one, suspend judgment?
Sure. Suspend judgment by creating a space between judgments and reactions. We can listen to one another and to ourselves more fully.
And Marcelo, if you could do the next one?
From you.
Oh, you're on mute, Marcelo. You may have stepped away. Mom, do you want to do turn to wonder?
Are you talking to me?
Yep.
I'm sorry, I don't have the sheet in front of me. I will
No.
just listen to what your son says.
No worries. We will go around the horn again here. Turn to wonder. If you find yourself becoming judgmental or cynical, try turning to wonder. I wonder what my reaction teaches me, or I wonder what they are feeling right now.
Practice confidentiality care. What is said here stays here, and what is learned here goes out.
Welcome discomfort and dislocation. Move against an instinct to construct a mental space of safety or to check out.
Love the questions themselves. Let your questions linger. Release the compulsion to answer them or to have them answered.
Great. Thank you very much. So I'll lead into this chapter a little bit. And hopefully everybody sees sort of the structure that how I took some of the chapters of the book, which the author put in a very specific way. That made his argument, the arc of the story he wanted to tell, be most effective. But because he sort of hints right up front, but then when he gets to the end, he lays it on in the verdict, the final chapter, right, which we handled first. So he leaves you at the end of the book with in no uncertain terms what he feels about Robert E. Lee, the Confederacy, a lot of the political, give and take accommodations, however you want to phrase it, that's going on with the lost men. Okay. And Josh and I, when we were starting to put this course together, we sort of wanted to take it in a different way. Okay. We wanted our arc to be a little bit different. We wanted to start right up front with the verdict. Okay. And get that up front because, we weren't, like the author, taking us on his journey. Okay. So that the verdict is his realization after, a lifetime of living this as a little kid. And then about halfway through starting to question, his very upbringing and his, how he self-identified. Right. But we're on a little bit different journey. We started with the verdict right up front. Okay, that was our start point. And what we did was we then went back to the beginning and followed the author on his journey about his hometown and his journey, some of his other, I think says adopted hometowns when he was moving around with his father in the deep or dirty South. And his formative years. Okay. And he sort of lays that out and shows us, how people are indoctrinated, not unwillingly, but unwittingly. There's a little bit of a difference there, unwittingly into this lost cause myth. Okay. They never have an opportunity to make an honest choice for themselves was one of his themes, right? Because multiple times he talks about, everything from how, textbooks were laid out and celebrate what things were celebrated, in the hometowns, but they never got the facts. In one point, I think in an early chapter, he says, I wish I had known how bad slavery was. Okay. So that's one aspect, slavery buried. Okay. Not mentioned, not in textbooks, nothing. And if it does come out. How does it come out? Like in,
Just like in the new Florida standards.
exactly, but I mean, like in
Gave them a job.
Yeah. some skills they transfer, right?
We prepared them
Yep.
for being
But in the children's books, right, it was this loving relationship and slavery was good for the slaves and, the Gone with the Wind kind of thing. And then, but in the one place he ends up, by choice, the first place he chooses, Washington and Lee, right? So then, he talks about how, that was like the, beginning of the rest of his life, to achieve this status in life as a, Southern gentleman in the model of Robert E. Lee, right? And then we took a look at his where he taught, my alma mater, how the issues were handled there. Okay. And by looking at those two academic institutions, how the issues were handled, it was two sides of the same coin, right? So they both ended up in about the same place, right? Where Confederacy ultimately, and Robert E. Lee, not necessarily the Confederacy, gets glorified. Okay, but
West Point came much, much later. That's the.
well, that's the other side of the coin.
Yeah,
So
but
from
it
day
was-
one,
it started that way, and then
Yep.
West Point's like, how did you do that?
no, exactly. It's
Yeah, we
so.
used to last week, because we were like.
Well, I'm actually, I was like, well, how did I schedule this for me to be gone on the 1 week? But I think that was almost better because then you could look at it objectively. And I'll bring in a couple things this week, but those are the two sides of the same coin. Washington and Lee, it's the immediate implantation of the lost cause myth in the person of Lee, and it is great. And we talked about how they talked about Richmond and Lexington, the Mecca, the Medina, his wife coming in, and Robert E. Lee was the altar, so it's a very like religious kind of establishment, right? And then at West Point, like you said,
Just like-
initially,
Yeah.
banned all the way up to the 1870s or so, or it was banned all the way up to 1898, excuse me. And then something happens, okay, and it starts to creep back in. And what happened was
Money.
a couple different things. Well, but it all revolved around the 100th anniversary. Okay, West Point founded 1802, 1902. Everybody, it's a new century. It's let's reconciliation, things like that, and it becomes now political expediency starts to come in. Always in the South, right? Bring the Southern states back in. Don't tell them how badly they were beaten. We'll try and heal or whatever. But again, one of the other themes that he has throughout the book is that this reconciliation and healing and coming back together was for whose purpose? White men.
Yep.
Okay, not for the slaves and the freedmen and all of that. It was for white men. But at West Point, turn of the century, coming up on the 100-year anniversary, and so they bring back James Longstreet, and who was like the one Confederate who probably was the most appropriate, right? But still, it's a toe in the door kind of thing. And then through a couple different other things, we saw in sort of the tit for tat kind of thing. Well, now Lee starts to emerge, and they name an award after him, and they put a portrait in there of him because, they have all of these portraits of the superintendents, and they line the mess hall now. I don't know where they were back then, but there wasn't one of him, and so UDC,
Yeah.
right? The Union of Daughters of the Confederacy or something like that.
United.
United Daughters. Right, they would never have unions
Oh,
there,
no.
for sure. And so now it starts to creep back in, and it's these, not, I wouldn't call these things necessarily political accommodations. That's more about how Fort Belvoir got its name, you know, with Franklin Roosevelt accommodating a senator that he wanted to push his, you know, great New Deal through, right? Like we read in this chapter. But then it's with West Point, it's like a frog in a pot of water, right? And if you throw the frog in a boiling pot of water, you know, it tries to get out. But if it's in there and you slowly turn the heat up, right, then it doesn't know, and it, you know, ultimately boils. And so that was last week. Okay, and we purposefully took this chapter out of order and put it at the end, because then it looks at this different type of institutionalization, okay, which is sort of a mix of accommodation and expediency. Okay, so you saw, we read about in primarily World War I and World War II, when there was this great mobilization. Okay, I think they said it went from about 100,000 to about 4 million in World War I, and then they went from about 150,000 to like millions, like more in World War II. I forget the exact number. But because of that, you had all of these camps that sprung up across, you know, the United States, and then, you know, the Army is part of the government, and, you know, change is abhorred, really. And, you know, there's a certain amount of laziness there. And but the point is, the author talks about the idea of a camp versus a fort. Okay, and back then it was sort of, a camp was just something that sprung up for expediency. You know, you needed to train a bunch of people. And then it was only going to stick around for as long as it was needed, then it went away. So there were camps that were like basic training, where you stood up these divisions, and they were usually in World War I, you brought people from a specific region, and they all came into a centrally located camp for training, right? But then in World War II, it was a little bit different. You drew people from all over the United States and put them together in units. For the most part, there's a couple of exceptions. And you brought them from all over and put them in a camp somewhere else, right? But the rules sort of remain the same, that the regional commanders or the camp commander got to name the thing, now the camp. But in some cases, you'd ask, there's examples of, you know, like in Georgia, Fort Benning. You know, the local population had a hand in naming the camp at the time, now fort. But some of these camps stuck around, and the names just stuck. You know, it was like the decision was, all right, well, you know, it's gonna be here for longer, so we're gonna make it into a fort and commit permanent resources to it instead of just a bunch of tents or wooden buildings. We're now gonna have, you know, make this into an installation. Right. And so the names just stuck, and without really any kind of thought. And so that's sort of where the expediency and the accommodation sort of comes together with the naming of a lot of these places. And the Army has always proliferated through the South. Okay, I mean, that's where its biggest recruiting base is. That's where most of the big bases are still. And part of that was, you know, because of the recruiting base, but also a lot of political accommodation. Like when, I don't know if anybody remembers BRAC, the base realignment and closure at the end of the Cold War. You know, how do you decide what to stay and what goes? Okay, so there was a lot of people like in West Virginia and the Carolinas and stuff that have been around forever, and that's where a lot of the places stayed, rather than some of the lesser places in the north, right, that were closed. A lot of smaller places up there. So now we have this issue of, 9, and I think the author says 10 because he brings in Camp Beauregard, which is think of it in terms of Camp Mabry. Okay, it's like one of those types of things, and Camp Mabry is stuck around because it started as a camp like all the other things. But the reason it stuck around is that it was retained by the state of Texas. Okay, and that's not a federal institution. There are some aspects of like regular Army kind of stuff there, primarily in a support and liaison capacity. But that is a Texas Armed Forces installation. That's where the state adjutant general has, state adjutant general has his office, and that's where the reserves and National Guard folks are from here in Texas. That's their haven. So that's why that's a camp, and that Camp Beauregard, I think, did the same thing down in Louisiana. It was not a federal institution, but so any questions? No?
What's that big book you have?
Well, I'll get to this. I'll get to this in a minute. So what I wanted to do, so this chapter, there was, and it primarily dealt with two things. It dealt with the naming of the Army installations, okay, and it dealt with cemeteries, okay, and those are two inherently different issues, okay, because one honors a person, okay, and I think we can all agree that were these people not Confederates, there were no way they would have an Army base named after them, because some of them were never in the Army really, except as political appointees, and they weren't really even very good at their job, except for 2 or 3 of them, right? I mean, objectively, good tacticians, strategists, fighters, whatever. But the issue of cemeteries is a little bit different. And I think my stance on this has evolved over the years, right? And earlier on in one of our early classes, somebody said, well, when we talked about monuments, and I think that was in where he talked about hidden racism in the monuments to the Confederates, and every little town in the South has a town square with an obelisk or a statue of the colonel of the regiment from that region or whatever. And so, well, how do you honor or memorialize, not necessarily honor, the people on the other side that fought, that weren't the colonels who were bought a regiment, with the money they had made off of their slave labor and their plantation, and outfitted a bunch of, just the common people that were out there living, and then took that to battle. Because that's how most of the units and the volunteers on both sides actually came about. Somebody, there was a rich landowner, plantation person, or businessman or whatever, bought a colonelcy, bought the rank of brigade commander and colonel, and then part of that was they had to outfit the unit. They had to recruit from their area, outfit the unit, and move it to wherever, and then once it got into the system, but they had the initial responsibility of standing up the unit and outfitting it, by and large, okay? But not those people. We're not talking, those are the ones that have the monument, and those should come down, right? But, the soldiers, how do because they, not saying they were victims, but they were in the situation where, they might not have been fighting for slavery. They may have been fighting because they got caught up in the whole thing. Anybody seen the remake of All Quiet on the Western Front? Not yet. Anybody's seen any version of it? Okay, so Judy, you know what I'm talking about. There's a beginning, but it's not the opening scene.
Yeah.
But it's the scene after the opening scene where they are mobilizing in it, and it's a snapshot of German mobilization in World War I. This is after the war's been going on for a while, okay? And it shows these German kids, basically. And I think they were university students, but they were young. And they got caught up in this whole speeches and rhetoric and everything. And, you know, they had no idea what was going on the front lines. They had probably also no idea what the hell they were fighting for, other than the fatherland, okay, Germany. And so off they go. And once they get to the front line, they're like, oh my goodness. This is not, you know, they all had visions of they were going to be the one that planted the flag in Paris, right? And then they get there and they're like, oh my goodness, what's going on? That theme pretty much is constant throughout history of warfare, right? First unit I was in when the first deployment I went on was an airborne unit in northern Italy. And we deployed after, so they did the whole Desert Storm or Desert Shield kind of buildup. And we sat in northern Italy and trained and did everything. And then during Desert Storm, then we moved over and we were in northern Iraq up in the mountains, right? So we weren't even down on the tabletop or the pool table. You know, we called it the desert, right? We were up, it was freezing cold in the mountains. But, you know, all these soldiers are all like, you know, yeah, we can't sit there. We got to get there. We got to, you know, we're going to be the only airborne unit in the Army that didn't go do something, right? So we move out, we go, you know, we cross over into northern Iraq, go up in the mountains, dig our foxholes in the side of these mountains, you know, you get about that deep and it's all shale. And then the very next day, you know what everybody was saying? When are we going home? How much longer we got here? This sucks, you know, and that's the way it always is, right? And so how, but that's that, I mean, that's what's going through the common soldier's minds. They're not, you know, sitting there like, I'm gonna kill these Yankees, you know, so the rich guy that lives in town, you know, not me in my dirt shack, can own a bunch of slaves. You know, that's not, so the idea of now, how do you take these people who are, first of all, humans, second of all, Americans, okay, because even though they viewed themselves as a different country that the North never did, okay, it was, you know, reconciliation, it wasn't like reunionization, right? So how do you now treat these people with decency, okay? So there's a growing part of that has come around, but then it gets hyper politicized is what I was thinking, but that's not, you get groups like the UDC, right, that take this issue that's moving and now being considered rationally, and how do we care for these graveyard, I mean, these were, you know, people, they're human, they were Americans, how do we treat them with respect, not, you know, memorialize them, not, you know, hold them up as great examples, but just treat them decently. And then, you know, other groups get involved and becomes politicized, right? When I was getting ready to leave Brussels in 2006, this same issue was coming in. This is 60 years after the end of World War II. The same issue was popping up with German cemeteries, war cemeteries in Europe. Okay, so you had different types of, so you had, of course, the US cemeteries that were over there that had been there since the end of the war and before the end of the war, that are we have
World War I,
there are some of those as well. So there's the World War I set, there's the World War II set, but those are all primarily the winners, right? The losing side, primarily Germany, but there's also, oddly enough, there's an in-between set of cemeteries that were the countries that Germany had conquered, occupied, conscripted their armies and brought them primarily to fight on the Western Front as the German armies were deployed to the Eastern Front against the Russians. Okay, so we weren't fighting a lot of Germans in some of these battles. We were fighting Poles, Hungarians, people from the Baltics. Okay, and so they had those countries now had come and were like, hey, you know, we don't want to be there, but we're gonna. So and mom and dad, you'll remember one of these places, Monte Cassino. I think when we went up and saw Monte Cassino in it's a mountaintop monastery that was between Naples and Rome on now Autostrada 1. And as the U.S. side of the Allied advanced, the Brits were on the other side, came up. This was an observation post, and they basically were calling in artillery and all this kind of stuff, and it stalled our advance. And so we leveled this monastery, and it was occupied largely by Polish forces. And so it's the biggest Polish graveyard outside of Poland in Chicago. And in Chicago. But that was sort of a median set of cemeteries. But the German cemeteries, especially World War II, no recognition, no anything. I mean, they were just sort of off on the side, and maybe some sympathetic locals would take care of them or anything, but there were never replaying, never anything like that, right? But now in 2006, what has happened is within NATO primarily, almost a complete renormalization of the German military. Okay, in fact, when I left, it was the chairman of the military committee, who's always a 4-star general, not US. We have the 3-star deputy, but the chairman of the military committee for the first time was a German in 2006. The Germans were heavily deployed in Afghanistan, not Iraq, Afghanistan. They had a whole regional command north. And so there was this reconciliation and normalization of the German army, okay, within Europe. And so this issue then came up as, well, how, again, you know, do we treat with respect and dignity these German soldiers in their graves? We're not talking about putting a statue of Rommel or, you know, their leadership or anything like that, but, you know, just the common soldiers. Okay, they got, and there's a recognition they might have gotten caught up in this as well, and everything like that. So that was starting to emerge. So my thoughts have changed on that over time as well. Do I think that, you know, the US government should in some way take care of those graveyards? Sure. Especially when I look at some of the other stupid things we spend an awful lot of money on. Okay. But do I think that there should be the statue that we read about in Arlington Cemetery? No. Okay. So there's some gray area in there. But I would open it up for folks' thoughts on that. Both, I mean, I think we can all sort of agree on the naming of army bases, right? But you know, what are your thoughts or feelings on, you know, the issue of cemeteries and things like that? That's why I asked.
Yeah, well, even to bury people, I mean, there has to be a place.
And we bury people and put markers on their graves who did wonderful things and horrible things. I mean, in the end, everybody dies, right? It's a person who had a life. Yeah, just thinking about this whole topic. I'm coming back to, I think, something that came up in the very first class that we had about how do you honor the dead? Shouldn't we, people who are grieving or who are remembering their ancestors, be able to honor them? And the answer is, well, yeah. But do we honor them in a graveyard? Or do we honor them in the public square? Do we honor them in front of the government buildings?
Yeah.
That's where, to me, saying we're gonna take that statue down from in front of our courthouse.
Yeah.
Is, we're gonna take that statue down from our government-supported university.
Yeah.
Yeah, get them out of there, put them somewhere
Put it in a
else.
museum.
Put them in a museum, put them in a graveyard.
Graveyard, yeah.
Put them in a graveyard, that's a lovely place to remember that there was a war and a lot of people died. And that people grieve for them, and they had lives, you know, including Robert E. Lee. You know, should all of the statues of Robert E. Lee be destroyed? No. But they shouldn't be in front of any kind of a government building. In my opinion, that the taxpayers are paying for, because those are people who fought the government that ended up winning. They didn't win. And if they had won, this would be a very different world, and we'd be having a very different conversation, but they did not.
Right, well, and because as the verdict, do we honor traitors?
Right.
You know, and as a leader, you know, as well, I think what you said makes, I was wondering about the Confederate cemetery and stuff. But there's a difference between the people who led, who made the decisions, who, you know, did this, and the people who followed. And everybody deserves to have their memory respected. But those leaders, and then whatever else they did, you know, whatever the last, but the leaders who were traitors to their country deserve absolutely nothing more than the respect of being a human being. They do not deserve any kind of glorification for glorification, that's what it, you know.
Yeah.
Not have forts named after them.
Of the government that they fought and tried to destroy. And I also think about, well, so this country was founded by a revolution. And there are many similarities. That people in the Americas decided that they didn't want to be British anymore. And declared war against their country and their king. And fought against them and killed as many of them as they could. And if we had not prevailed, if the British had won and squashed the rebellion and squashed the rebellion against Britain and the king of Britain, again, the world would be a very different place. But would George Washington be honored in England or in, you know, or in Canada, or, you know, I mean, Canada continues to be part of Great Britain, and I don't, so anyway, it's that kind of, but we did win.
I think if we look at it, this is part of our history. And just as we might look individually at ourselves, maybe there's times when we are, you know, prouder of ourselves than maybe at other times in our lives. And to me, I don't see a need of digging up and moving any of these graves, because this is part of history. And just from a personal point of view, having just lost, you know, my husband, and he wanted to be cremated, and there are you know, a handful of places where I and family members will spread his ashes, because he has specific places, 5 different places that he wanted his ashes. So you know, we learn a lot about history.
Like, I think there's a difference inherently between treating somebody that, you know, lived and died, okay, with dignity and respect as a human, you know, at their final resting place, versus promulgating a lost cause myth.
Yes.
Okay, and so
Yeah.
clearly the, you know, statues and the town squares and things, whether they're government supported or not, are in one camp. And, you know, a graveyard with a couple of hundred rebel soldiers' graves is different. And I think that there's also something to be learned by, you know, having a debate about, does the government maintain these cemeteries and all this kind of stuff that brings that back in, you know, like allows for the lost cause myth to be refuted and, you know, the true nature of the thing to be brought back into the public sphere. So I think to a certain degree, the maintenance or the, you know, the upkeep and maintenance of these cemeteries, you know, brings that part out rather than, you know, having something in the town square where you lay a Confederate wreath at. But I'm still, you know, the details are always in the execution. So when I read the part, if you've ever been to Arlington or any of the federally or state maintained war cemetery or military cemeteries, the headstones are all pretty much the same. There's some kind of religious thing or nothing. And then there's always sort of the name and the rank that they had, some awards, their dates of service and date of, you know, their life. Now, some of them up when Navy Bob was what I called him, but the old
Bob
Wood, I couldn't. But when Jock and I went up to his interment up in the cemetery up by Colleen, I was looking at how they did, and they had, you know, like phrases and stuff on there. It's a little more personal. You go to Arlington, it's very stark. But you know, so I'm a little uncomfortable at having maybe a headstone that has, you know, the Confederate whatever army logo on there or something. But again, you know, you get down to that point, you're, in my mind, you're almost splitting hairs at that level. But again, if it brings a debate back out into the public sphere, that's probably not a bad thing at all. Any thoughts, comments, things from our folks in Zoom land? Kitty, Marcelo, Mom, Dad?
I have been, my son was at Fort Lee and Fort Polk. And my husband was Indian, Comanche Indian. And I visited Fort Sill in Oklahoma, where he went to school, and the cemetery there for the Comanches. I think my whole takeaway from reading this book and everything is we still have work to do.
Yep. Amen.
Kitty, that is a great segue. Okay? Because before we segue though, I want to say Fort Sill, I was based there 2 times and have been back 2 times, excuse me, since then to visit. And the first time I was there, and Mom and Dad, this doesn't count when we went through on a family vacation back in the early 80s. The first time I was there was the late 80s, when it was the first place I was assigned as an artillery officer. Fort Sill is home of the artillery. And so every brand new artillery officer, as well as artillery enlisted person, goes to basic training there, and the officers go to officer basic course. And the graveyard you're talking about, Kitty, is out there, and back when Fort Sill was an open post, and you can still get on to go see some of the museums, you can get a day pass, is where Geronimo's buried.
Yes.
There's still part, it was an old frontier post, and there's a couple of buildings that have remained, one of which was the prison where Geronimo was kept until he died. But then his grave is about 4 miles down some old pathway, you know, not paved road. Well, it may be paved now, but it wasn't a couple of years. And it's out there sort of in a field, a grove of trees. And it's, I I want to say a bunch of cannonballs or rocks that are stacked. It's like a pyramid.
Mhm.
And when I went there, it was just a little plaque that said Geronimo right there. And you could drive out to it and not even a parking lot, just park under a tree because of the heat, walk out there and see this thing. That's all it was. When I went, and it was a very popular running route because it was about 2.5 or 3 miles from a PT field back. So it was a good 5-mile run. You know, we're good. Where are you going to go PT today? Running Geronimo's Bridge. When I went back and I took Scotty there and my older son, Mark, it is completely different now. First of all, it's treated like it's federally maintained military graveyard. Because like Kitty said, it's the Comanche graveyard. They over time, you know, you had the Comanche scouts that served in the military, the frontier military as scouts. They were actually part of the military. And so the Comanches over a period of time and other Indians that are in similar circumstances petitioned and said, hey, these weren't just Indians, you know, or whatever. These were, you know, people that were in the army. And so they went and they now have headstones, and just like in Arlington, children, wives, everything. But the thing is, they were always buried there. You didn't know it. Geronimo's grave. So when you went back there, Geronimo's grave is like in the middle of this, and it's not like the lined up headstones in Arlington, but the headstones are arranged, and there's like a family of Comanches here because it was the scout and his family, you know, a couple of wives, maybe, I don't know, over a period of time or all together, and their kids are all buried there, and they're federally maintained, and it's quite actually a beautiful place, but also, you know, an important part of history, you know. And so Kitty, I just wanted to say that. Mom, I saw your hand go up.
Yes, am I on, oops, am I muted? Can you
Yep.
hear me? Yeah. No, I think your point, the difference between a resting place, a graveyard, honoring soldiers who fought bravely for whatever cause, and the glorification of leaders who were, as he kind of assumes or decides at the end, treasonous, is a whole different thing. Taking statues away, I think even of like in Arlington now, renaming Lee Highway, which goes for miles and miles. And I kind of think, what is the point? I mean, who remembers how that is connected? But if you have a huge statue in the middle of a town square, I think to glorify that is just so very different from establishing the cemeteries. And I loved, John, on page 155, and it kind of in the middle of the page, and this is back before the turn of the century. Army planners during this period set out the informal policy on naming, for example, naming of forts. But in the middle, finally, the War Department wanted to ensure no camp name would offend local sensibilities. And I think that goes to your political expediency. Keep everyone happy. And I think that's a very different issue.
Right, so long, it definitely in the example, Mom, that's a great one. But the example that the author uses is you didn't want to put, you know, Camp Sherman in Atlanta.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so the pendulum swung the other way, and they let, you know, that, well, we're going to name it Camp Gordon, you know. So segue, Kitty, thank you, from what I think is you know, a very delicate and emerging issue of things like cemeteries to something that's inarguable but finally corrected. Okay, so I went on, so everybody's aware that Fort Hood is now Fort Cavazos, right? So I went and found the names, the old names of the fort. Oh, yeah, there we go. The old names of the fort and the new names that, which they're all going to be renamed. Okay, so what I want everybody to do, we're gonna do a practical exercise, like 5 minutes, okay? If you have your Google machine, your phone or whatever. I'll assign the names, okay? So Natalie, why don't you look up Old Fort Pickett, New Fort Barfoot.
Okay,
Judy, why don't you do Rucker and Novacell? Marie, Benning and Moore, that's a good one, because a lot of people know who Moore is. And if you could do AP Hill and Walker. Kitty, if you could do Fort Hood and Cavazos. Marcelo, if you could do Fort Lee and Fort Gregg dash Adams. And I don't know if that's one person's name that's hyphenated or two.
It's 2 people.
Okay, Mom and Dad, if you could do Fort Polk and Fort Johnson. And just Google, probably the easiest way, because there's, if you just Google, you know, Fort Johnson, you might come up with a ton. But probably the easiest way, Google, you know, Fort, just the 2 fort names or something. And take about 5 minutes, and then we'll go around the room, and I want to hear just a blurb about who the new person is.
I'm not getting internet.
No internet?
Yeah,
It took a minute, but mine came back.
Okay, I'll
Can you Google Johnson? Because I can't leave this to Google.
I'll go ahead and if we don't have them right away, if there's an issue, no worries. You know, but I just thought it would be interesting because I know like maybe 3 of them. Okay, I don't know who Barfoot is. I don't know who Novacell. I know Moore. I know Walker. I know Cavazos. I knew, but like Greg Adams, and I don't know which Johnson. I suspect it's World War I Johnson. And I will handle Fort Bragg and Fort Gordon as Fort Liberty and Fort Eisenhower.
it finally came.
Okay, you got it, Judy.
Okay.
No, if you don't have internet or something, that's fine. We'll just. They ended up there.
When I Googled Fort Rucker, it came up Fort Nova, so.
Yeah.
Yep.
Same thing.
Yep, okay, good. Because and Marie said, you know, when she read this, and Marie, if I may misquote you a little bit, that reading about, you know, the people that these forts were named after was devastating, I think you said. And so I wanted to end on a happy note.
Yeah.
You know, because now, you know, this isn't that old a book, and the author says, you know, talking about renaming forts and things at West Point, you know, it's up to the people who it's up to, and they'll get to it when they get to it. So that's the way the law is. Okay, hey, anybody ready? Anybody want to go first? Kitty, I saw your hand first.
Okay. I was looking it up and I didn't realize that this was so recent. This name change from Fort Hood to Cavazos was May of this year. And it is in honor of the first Latino 4-star general. He was Texas born, served in Mexican American, but I didn't realize it was that recent.
Yes, now that was like one of the first ones, I think.
Yeah, they're all this year.
Yes,
yeah, this
So-
was February.
Cavazos was on active duty when I was on active duty. And I mean, so I've been on active duty for a while. But he not only was he the first Hispanic or Latino 4-star general. He was the first Latino at every flag rank in the Army. He was the first 1-star, the first 2-star, first 3-star, first 4-star, and retired as one of the more senior 4-star billets. He was I want to say TRADOC Force Com commander. So he was either in charge of the training of every unit in the Army or the operational readiness of every unit in the Army. Those are what those two commands are. Okay. So very apt. Texas native, honoring, you know, first past the post in every significant way. Inarguable, right? Who's going to argue about that? Who wants to go next? Marcelo, did I see your hand? Or was he
So mute.
mute?
Sorry, yeah, I said I can go.
Okay.
So Fort Greggs Adams is named after two people. One of them is Charity Adams Early, and she was in the United States Army. She was the first woman to be an officer in the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. And she was the commanding officer of the 1st Battalion of African American women to serve overseas during World War II. And then Arthur J. Gregg was a lieutenant general, and he was the first African American to achieve such a high rank. He is also the first person that I believe a fort was named after while they were still alive, as opposed to posthumously.
Wow. Nice. And that was Fort Lee, the old Fort Lee.
It was former Fort Lee in Virginia, yeah.
You know, leaders, you know, African American leaders of both genders, right? And that may be the first fort that I know of that's named after a woman.
Actually, Fort Moore is also,
Fort which?
Fort Moore,
Oh, okay. More?
yeah.
Okay.
So Fort Moore is named after, I'll just go since it
Yep.
relates, Hal Moore.
Yes.
Harold, who was a Vietnamese war lieutenant, who was a colonel.
Yep.
And he was, if you saw the film We Were Soldiers in 2002, which starred Mel Gibson, that
Yep.
has to do with the battle that he was in.
I dragged battle. I dragged battle.
First
Okay,
battle of
but-
Vietnam.
But it's also named for his wife,
Yep.
who was, she was, as you talk about the women who complained, she prompted the US Army to set up survivor support networks and casualty notification teams consisting of uniformed officers that is still practiced today, and that she was the instigator.
So if you saw that movie, I forget who plays his wife. But this was the first, so the Air Mobile using helicopters to move people around in Vietnam on a large scale. Hal Moore was a lieutenant colonel that commanded the 1st Battalion that used these tactics in Vietnam. Okay, and it was the Battle of the Ai Drag Valley, where it was the first time they helicoptered in a large unit. They were ambushed. It was, you know, lost a lot of people. And as they were fighting this battle over a period of days, and people were being wounded and killed, the Department of Defense was sending out cables to people, and they were showing up, you know, having taxi drivers bring these cables to people's houses. And so then, you know, she would eventually catch on and would see the CADs coming to these people's houses, and then was like, hey, you know, this is not the way this needs to go down. So
She was played by Madeline Stowe.
yes, Madeline Stowe. Yep. Okay, who wants to go next?
I have Barfoot.
Okay,
So this installation is the only Army National Guard installation that's being renamed. It was, and this took effect in March of this year. And he was a Medal of Honor recipient in World War II for his actions as a technical sergeant in the 45th Infantry fighting in Italy against the Germans. So, but then he did tours in Korea, Vietnam.
does it say anything about his heritage?
It says he has extensive ties to Virginia.
Okay,
So, yeah, so I don't know all these county names. He settled in Amelia County, eventually moved into Henrico County.
Yep.
Anyway, He's a Virginia.
Well, that's, Enrico County is where the old Fort AP Hill, now Fort Barfoot is located. And
Okay,
it's a big, like you said, it's a National Guard or a reserve base, and that's a huge training area. That, when reserve units will, or National Guard units will go training, they go to that big training area.
it also says he has a significant Native American here.
There you go.
His grandmother was a Choctaw,
Yep,
and so the Choctaw Nation and some nations were gonna come to that renaming.
Yep.
in honor of him.
yep. Judy, are you good?
Yes, it's in the fort's in Alabama, and it's renamed for Chief Warrant Officer Michael J. How would you
Yep.
say it's Cavosel?
Novacell.
Novacell.
Yep.
Who is an Army aviator and Medal of Honor recipient.
Yep.
And there's a picture of him, and it looks like, World War II,
Yes.
so.
Yeah, so that's also very fitting because Fort Rucker is where Scotty's grandparents lived outside of, and it's a home of Army aviation. And so very fitting that they would honor both a warrant officer, which does, 75 to 80% of the flying, rotary wing helicopters in the Army, but also an aviator. So warrant officer and an aviator. So that makes sense as well. Is anybody not gone? Walker, did
He
some,
wasn't able to get.
oh, you weren't, okay, so no, but so we see the trend,
Yeah,
okay, inarguably, much more fitting names. Okay, not just, these are the kind of people you want to have with like installations named after them, okay, let alone the fact they're replacing a bunch of Confederates.
right.
Okay, who, most of whom weren't really good at their job anyway, right? And so that, I mean, there's any number, they could have been Union generals that weren't good at their job, and these are much more fitting names.
Yeah.
So the last two, okay, Marie asked me, or Judy, somebody asked me what this book was. Can you reorient me?
Oh, yeah.
Put it on me. So we read about Cullum, right? General Cullum, who was brought in very strongly anti-Confederate, and he wiped all Confederate officers from the records, even their service as cadets or before as U.S. Army officers, right? Cullum Hall, and we talked about how he established the Association of Graduates at West Point to promote those officers who had stayed loyal, okay, to the U.S. Army during the Civil War. So one of the knock-on effects of his work there was every graduate of West Point that graduates gets what we call a Cullum number. Okay, it used to be like and I think they redid it in 1980, but before 1980, they're consecutive and they're based on your class rank. So the first person in your class rank would get the next number after the last person in class rank of the year before you. By the time I got there, they were assigned alphabetically. I don't even know what my Cullum number is, like 47,000 and something, right? But the very first graduate, number one. And then the Associate of Graduates puts out, used to be annually. Now, since everything's online, I don't even think you can buy one of these books, but it used to be annually. They would put out a book that had the biography of every graduate from West Point.
Wow.
Now, what they would do every 10 years, they would put out the whole list from 1 until whatever. Every year, 1 through 9, they would put out, but the biographies, but it would start with the oldest graduate or the first class that had at least one living graduate still. And then they go forward. So if there was nobody that was alive and anything before that, those classes would just get rolled up because nothing was going to change, right? And there are standard, and it tracks your whole career, both you know, from your graduation, all the units you were in, conflicts you were in, awards you had gotten, but there were thresholds for everything, right? And then even it would track what you did after you retired, okay, types of things. And so what I wanted to do was, I think everybody understands who Eisenhower is, right? So I wanted to read Eisenhower's biography from the Register of Graduates. Okay, so you can see what kind of information gets captured in here. So Eisenhower was in West Point class of 1915. Couple interesting things about the class of 1915. It's referred to, a couple of classes here have names. This is the class the stars fell on because it has the highest percentage of flag officers of any class at West Point. So, I mean, obviously Eisenhower, 5 of them himself, but he also had a classmate, a guy named Omar Bradley.
Yeah.
Okay, and so forth and so forth. Okay, but I'll go ahead and read Eisenhower's, and it's all like sort of code and stuff. So, but born Texas, 14 October 1890. I didn't know that's like a day after Scotty. My dad. He was commissioned in the infantry. He was an infantry officer. His and so when you have like a long history, they don't put every single assignment, especially after you pass away. Then they scale it back according to like major assignments. During World War I, he was assigned to a tank corps from 1918 to 1999. He got a Distinguished Service Medal. That's like top, very significant level. Then starting in World War II, it picks it back up, doesn't trace all this stuff he did in between. He was Chief of Staff of the 3rd Division in 9th Corps, 3rd U.S. Army from 1940 to 1941. So when the war started, when we came into the war, that's what he was doing. And then he was chief of a branch in basically the War Department General Staff. Okay, what we would now call the joint staff, and he worked for the Marshall. Okay, when Marshall was in the War Department there, then he went from there, basically lieutenant colonel to he's now the commanding general of the East European Theater of Operations in 1942. So it basically went from the lieutenant colonel up to 4-star and then 5-star in a couple of years. And he was commander-in-chief of NATO in Italy in 42-43, commander-in-chief of the Allied Expeditionary Forces, commander-in-general of the U.S. Forces military governing body that as we rolled through and defeated the Germans at the end of the war. And then he was the chief of staff of the Army, okay, basically afterwards. They didn't have chairman at that point. Then it says many honors and decorations, exempted from retirement for age by an act of Congress in 1948, president of Columbia University in 1948, Supreme Allied Commander Europe 50 to 52 when he came back on and became the first SAC-EUR, okay, of NATO. Retired in May 52, resigned his commission in 52. There's legal thing back then. 34th president of the U.S. from 1953 to 1961. Reappointed general of the armies in March 1961, where what they did was 5-star was a wartime rank, and so when he retired, he went back to 4 stars. But then they made it a formal thing. Along with a couple other things, they made Blackjack like Pershing, they made him 5-star general, formalized the rank, and they made Washington a 6-star general. So no general would ever outrank Washington. He was awarded the Thayer Medal, which is a distinguished graduate type medal. In 1961, there was an assembly, which is a magazine put out by West Point, devoted to his life. And then died Walter Reed Hospital, Washington, D.C., 28 March 1969. So that's what this publication by the Associate of Graduates does for every graduate. And you're responsible to a certain point for feeding the beast. Like you can go in there and tell them awards and all of that. So some of them are very short, okay, but some of them are, especially someone like there was a president, right? Very extensive. Now, for comparison, remember Cullum, anti-Confederate. You know, this was primarily, this book had its origin in promoting the officers that had stayed loyal to the Army, right? So when they went back and did this reconciliation and they assigned the Cullum numbers, they brought all of the Confederate people who had graduated from West Point back in. So let's now read what it says about Robert E. Lee. And I have to find out where he is. So he was class of 1829, second in his class, okay? Born Virginia, right? He was a Corps of Engineers. So Eisenhower was infantry, Lee was engineers. He received 3 brevets in the Mexican War and was wounded at Chapultepec. Okay, so remember in here it said they didn't, the first battlefield honor for valor was Medal of Honor, which was established in the Civil War. But before that, the way that you didn't get an award, you got a promotion. So that's how you have folks like General Custer becomes the youngest general in the Army at 25 years old, about 4 years after he graduated from West Point, because of valor as a cavalryman. Okay, not because, you know, he kept getting bigger ranks and like we do, or commands like we do now. Superintendent of West Point from 52 to 55. So they talk about his services in the Mexican War and his superintendent. Okay, resigned 1961. Okay, as a colonel. Then it says General in Chief, Confederate States of America. Okay. Then it says President, Washington College, Lexington, Virginia, 1965-1970. No glorification of any battles, no war record, nothing. Okay. An acknowledgement that, you know, that's what he did. Son of Colonel Henry Lee, Revolutionary Army, Hall of Fame for Great Americans, 1900. Right? And then died in Lexington, Virginia, 12 October. That's a day before Scotty's birthday and Dad's birthday. In 1870. Okay. Very short, just acknowledges, focuses on what he did in the Army, and then, you know, said a rank that he had as a Confederate. That's it. And all the Confederates in here are handled that same way. Focuses on their time in service, and then, you know, says whatever, colonel of whatever in the Confederacy. Okay. And because I know you all want to hear my biography in here. And this was 2002, so I still had a couple of years to go. But so born Virginia, 27 February 1967, field artillery. I was field artillery officer. First assignment was Northern Italy from 90 to 92. Then I was in 2nd Ranger Battalion at Fort Lewis, 92, 93. Then I went back over to Germany, was in an artillery unit, deployed to Iraq while I was there. Then went another tour in Germany, went to Bosnia. Then it stopped when I was a First Infantry Division had a thing there. Then I went to DLI, Defense Language Institute to learn Dutch. I went to Georgetown, got a master's degree, then was assigned to the embassy in The Hague. And that's sort of where that stops. So it'll track your whole career, and then again, when you pass away, then that probably gets shortened, to just like key things. So that's what the book, and I mean, you can see how small the print is.
Yeah.
So it's a but this also the associated graduates in this, and this was the bicentennial edition, right? So they had a lot of other stuff, but it tracks Medal of Honor winners. It tracks people who are what we call legacy. So it'll track generations, and it has to be one to say legacy. It has to be one sort of branch of the tree over. So if you had a mother or father that went there, then that's a direct legacy. But if you had like your grandfather and then your uncle, and then they'll track that because it's one off, right? And there's some people that go like 9 generations,
Wow.
or more. So we'll end talking about Fort Bragg.
It's
Okay.
almost 1:00.
Oh,
I mean,
okay.
Yes.
So
This is fascinating, but
who is Fort Liberty?
it's not a person,
Right. Why is it not a person?
because they couldn't agree.
They couldn't agree, and who couldn't agree?
There's 2 units that are there, something else.
Army Special Operations Command and the 82nd Airborne Division, 2 of the most storied units in the Army, could not agree and do something like Greg Adams to get memorialized people. And, you got James Gavin, Jumping James Gavin, who commanded the division throughout all of World War II, and then was an ambassador. He was a 3-star general, and then was the ambassador to France. Can't figure out how to get that guy's name on the front gate. You got all kinds of Medal of Honor winners and, groundbreaking people of every race, creed, even now gender, from Special Operations Command. Can't figure out how to get those names on there with a hyphen in between. Ridiculous. I almost would have rather it stayed as Fort Bragg, because then at least you have a conversation about who was this idiot Bragg, and what was he all about, right? Because he's sort of a rat, So anyway, that kills me that they can't.
They couldn't just flip a coin.
And Liberty, why pick a better something? Okay. With an eye towards time. Thank you, Marie. And I'm sitting here looking right at the clock, but could do this
You're
round.
wrapped up.
Yep.
Yes. It's fascinating.
Okay, so if for those of you that have the sheet still open, I'll give you a second. Natalie's furiously.
Here somewhere. There it is.
Okay, if you could all join me in our closing prayer. God, make us instruments of your justice. Where there is false and untenable peace, let us sow dissent. Where there is injustice, fury. Where there is oppression, hope. Where there is false fluorescence, profound darkness. Where there is social depression, light. Where there is crime and poverty, sustainable economic infrastructure. Granted, we may not so much seek to be uplifted as to uplift, to be seen as any others. For it is in protesting the sin of the system that we can more fully acknowledge our own sin. It is in demanding justice of the powerful that we live out God's demands for us. And it is in rejecting the American dream that we are born into God's faith. Amen. Thank you all very much. And last class, I think, next week. And so I think it's epilogue, right? And so some of this will already be overtaken, because I think he talks in there about, we need to rename forts and do stuff. And what I'll do is I'll call back. I was in Panama all week until late last night. I'll call back to West Point and see what they're doing about Lee Gate and all of that.
That'd be good.
Yeah, give us an update.
Yes, ma'am. We know how to shut this.
I think so, yes. think it's the.
The sheet, I'll go ahead and